Welcome, y'all. It's Wes with DIY Food Plot Pro. Thanks so much for joining us. Today's episode, we're going to talk about soybeans. More specifically, we're going to talk about some characteristics of picking a good quality soybean that's going to be good for a food plot. Now, a couple of these things a lot of us have heard of, and a couple of these things, I'm going to say 99% of food plotters have never heard of when it comes to having a successful soybean food plot, keeping that seed viable for long periods of time over the winter for those whitetails. My name is Wes. I run the channel DIY Food Plot Pro. I have a Bachelor of Science in Agronomy degree. I farm for a living, and I have a 1,800-acre whitetail deer hunting outfitter business in Western Kentucky where we cannot use bait to hunt the deer here. So we rely on these food plots that I produce on the channel to be able to hunt these whitetails that we're blessed to hunt. We all understand that growing soybeans on said food plot for seed production requires a lot of work on our part as to keeping those whitetails off, whether that's a fence, a scarecrow, waiting till later on in the season and not planting in the very first time the ground's warm in the spring. A lot of different variables we can use to help us and control that food plot to be able to have success on that food plot. In the past, when I've wanted to produce a soybean food plot, I've typically just been going for high quality summer forage all season long. And by doing that, I'm planting a much higher rate. I'm trying to keep the deer off for a week or 10 days and getting that first trifoliate to come out of that soybean plant. When that first trifoliate comes out, those deer can chew that soybean all the way to the ground, and it's going to do nothing but sprout back, sprout back, sprout back. So at that point, you've won the battle. You have a highly nutritious food plot system for those deer to feed off of all summer long. What I'm talking about today is when we're getting into seed production. So a lot of folks are wanting to plant soybeans for the seeds later on, kind of like we do on a corn food plot. We're going to leave that standing for those whitetails. We're going to interseed some cereal grains, some brassicas into those soybean plots. We're going to combine 2 or 3 plots into one. So what I really like to do on the channel is have a lot of food plots in one location. This way I can raise 3 times as much food on only one amount of the acres. So it works out really well. I've had a lot of folks reaching out through the subscription channel, and they're asking about soybeans. So I feel like if they are, there's probably a lot of y'all are as well. This aspect of raising soybeans to be able to hunt over standing beans in the winter typically doesn't get talked about a whole lot. This is something that really gets left out of the equation. In my opinion, from my ag side, from my whitetail side, this is likely one of the most important parts of designing a soybean food plot on your farm. Many of us are looking for the highest yielding soybeans that are out there, and that makes perfect sense, right? We want the most amount of grain produced that we can for those whitetails. So if we have 50 bushel per acre soybeans and they weigh 60 pounds a bushel, well, we've made 3,000 pounds of grain for those whitetails per acre. On the flip side of that, if we were to pick a bad variety, or if we had a real drought year, we might make 10 bushel soybeans and they weigh 60 pounds a bushel. We might only produce 600 pounds of grain per acre, and we definitely want that higher range. But there's something just as important as yield, is actually more important than yield for us whitetail food plotters. Yield is not the number one thing that I'm looking at when I'm picking a soybean seed. There's a lot of characteristics that when you start looking up these soybeans, you're gonna see what they're resistant to as far as Roundup, Enlist, Liberty. You're gonna be looking at disease packages. You're gonna be looking at yields. The most important thing, in my opinion, on these soybeans that most food plotters should be looking at is what we call standability and shatter. Let's dive into standability. What standability is how good is that particular plant at staying upright, right? Because if they fall on the ground, They're down in the mud, they're down in the frost, in the freezing. That's not good for the quality of our soybeans, right? They're going to start rotting on us. It's not going to be as useful for the whitetails if we plant a whole bunch of soybeans and they all just end up falling over. First big rain you're going to get, it's going to start germing a lot of those. You're going to have a lot of quality issues. Those whitetails are not going to eat those once those soybeans start to rot. A fella might ask, what is shatter? When a soybean gets done growing for the year, it reaches maturity, it starts turning yellow. At that point, those seeds inside there are still great big. They've got to go through the drying process, as does the entire plant. When we're looking at soybeans, we're looking at around 13 to 13.5% is going to be dry. So when those soybeans shrink and shrink and shrink and they finally get down to 13%, a lot of these higher yielding varieties need to be harvested right then and there. And that would not be a variety that, as food plotters, that we would want to pick. We would not be interested in that variety, because what happens is you've got a soybean sitting there in your pot. Let's say a rain system comes and it starts picking up moisture. That soybean seed that was, let's say, 12% moisture is now all of a sudden at 25% moisture or 30% moisture. It swells back up. Soybeans take in and get rid of moisture daily. But big changes like that from a rainstorm are going to thin the pod walls, and they're going to start calling what we call shatter. And what shatter is when that pod wall splits open. And what happens when that pod wall splits open? Seeds fall out on the ground. And they're no good for our whitetails at that point, unless they're consumed within a couple of days of that happening. They're going to hit the ground. The ground's going to be wet in the fall, and they're going to start taking a lot of moisture in. More than likely, they're going to rot. They're not going to be good for the whitetails. What we want is a soybean that's going to stand straight up, and we want those pods to stand firm. The longer they can stay in that pod, the more beneficial they are to our whitetails. It's kind of like corn. A lot of you guys used to use corn, maybe some of you still do. If you throw it on the ground and it gets a big rainstorm and it's warm, what's going to happen? The corn rots. But at the same time, if you've got corn in a field, it's still standing there with the stalk. It can rain 50 inches on it, and it's not going to rot that corn seed out. It can still take moisture out, put moisture back in. Same way with the soybean seed. If a soybean is still standing there, it's fine. Once it falls over, hits the soil, then all of a sudden we've got trouble. So shatter is a great big thing that we all need to be looking at when we're picking soybean seed we want to plant on our food plots. Now, a lot of you might ask, why is a soybean doing that right there? What's causing that? And that is back to any plant wants to reproduce. That's what they want to do. Any plant, it's either going to drop its seed or it's going to taste good so birds will eat it and deposit that seed. Soybeans have grown, they reach maturity, they're finally dry, and then they drop. And that produces a new generation of soybeans. Well, we as food plotters, we don't want that to happen. That's not good for us when that happens. We want those soybeans to remain in that pod for as long as they possibly can. So when you're going through a variety book and you're trying to pick out your varieties, you need to be looking at standability, and you need to be looking at shatter loss on these soybeans. It would really suck to have 50 bushel soybeans out here in this food plot, and when you walk out there and there's soybeans all over the place and they're not in the pods anymore. That would really suck for you to have worked all year long to produce that plot, kept the whitetails off of it, planted a big enough plot so that it could survive and actually make seed, and then all of a sudden to be wiped out by something that most of us have never even heard of. We deal with this a lot in the ag industry. We plant a lot of racehorse soybeans that are trying to max yield. Well, part of that is that package is not as good on those. So as soon as they hit 13, 14% moisture, we got a combine in there and we're hitting them. Because if you don't, you will start seeing soybeans all over the ground like you sowed them out there with your 3-point spreader. And that's not what we're looking for at all. There is a big difference between picking a ag variety and picking a wildlife variety. A lot of you know I plant a lot of ag beans for my food plots, but it's very important to note I'm planting ag beans in my food plots, but I'm not planting the same type of seed, the same number, because those ones that I'm planting for the ag side, have a higher yield potential, but they also have a higher management to manage that shatter. You have to harvest them quick. We don't want that for a whitetail food plot. We want a soybean that is resistant to as many diseases as we have. We want a soybean that has a extremely good standability. We want a soybean that has a very good shatter resistance, because we want those soybeans to be there for those whitetails right now. Early February, late January, we want these whitetails to have this food to be able to hunt over and then to be able to sustain them through winter time. Look at those two and make a good decision for the food plots that you're going to plant. If you need extra help with your food plot, I have a website set up, www.diyfoodplotpro.com. I have a monthly and a yearly subscription where you can email or text me. You can ask questions just like what we just discussed here. There's a lot of things that go deeper than these videos with these food plots. Feel free to text or email me, and I will personally respond and answer to you to the best of my ability and try to help you have higher quality food plots. If that's something that you're interested in, go to www.diyfoodplotpro.com. Thank you so much for watching the video. Smash that like and subscribe button.